us on this online platform to discuss the East Yale Avenue Corridor Study. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to log on. I'm going to give everyone about a minute or so, but thank you again all for joining us. We had a lot of folks respond, so hoping for a large group. All right. And while we're waiting, feel free to play around with your Zoom settings to make sure the full screen is expanded. You can move the videos around to kind of get them out of the way using a lot of the tabs on the top right. So feel free to play around with that while we get situated. But with that, I'm gonna jump off and we're gonna get this presentation started. So again, thank you all for joining us for the East Yale Corridor Study open house, virtual open house. This is the first of several public meetings or engagement events we will hold for this study. We hope there may be a chance to meet you all in person one day, but like you, we are taking it one day at a time. And for now, we will continue to provide as many socially distant ways we can to engage and provide feedback as it relates to this exciting study. So my name is Ashley Grace. I will be acting as the moderator for this evening's meeting. I am a project manager and community designer in the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. In my role at the city, I not only manage the design of major multimodal projects, but I also work to coordinate multimodal efforts throughout Southeast Denver and specifically in Council Districts 4, 6, and 10. So as a result, you may hear me chime in from time to time if questions are raised that relate to other efforts that are outside of the Yale Corridor Study. I'm also joined by my colleague, Geneva Hooten. She is a transportation planner in our department and is the city's project manager for this study. And we also have Ryan Mulligan that you'll be hearing from. He is the lead from our consultant team from Parsons, and he will be speaking to us as well. Of course, there are a number of other staff members, both from the city and from our consultant team on the webinar, who have helped us pull not only the webinar together, but are working hard on this entire effort. And I want to thank all of them for joining us and everything they've been putting into it. And finally, I would like to thank Councilman Cashman and Councilwoman Black. I believe they might both be on the line now. And thank you to you all and your offices and your strong support for this study and for all that you guys have been doing to make sure that we as a city staff are well attuned to your residents, your constituents' concerns, ideas, and thoughts about how we can make Denver a better place. So before we jump in, I want to make sure we're as oriented as we can be in this new virtual setting, this new virtual world we all live in. I know this is a new meeting format for many. So with that, myself, Geneva, and Ryan, we're going to be delivering a live presentation. So hopefully most of you are able to join in via the webinar. There is a call-in function in case you are having issues streaming this. You can at least listen by the phone. We are going to be recording. We actually are recording this meeting. And so if you miss something or have a technical issue and need to hop off, you can always check out the recording once we have that posted on our website, which will be within the coming weeks. We are going to stop for a couple of Q&A sessions. There is a chat box that is where we'll be taking in questions as we move through the presentation. You can either submit them as they come to you, and or we will again have actually 3 different Q&A sessions where we'll be pausing the presentation to answer some of those questions. And again, feel free to play around with your Zoom settings if you're new to Zoom. There are different ways to kind of expand your screen and make it easier for you to follow along. I do want to say that, like you all, we are adjusting to this new COVID-19 reality, which includes working from home. First of all, thank you for doing your part to keep Denver safe by staying at home. We recognize it is not easy. It comes at a great cost for many, but we are very, very appreciative and are doing our best to keep things moving through these new virtual settings. Second, again, we too are working from home, so apologies in advance if pets or my little 2-year-old or whomever, other unpredictable critters make their way into the webinar. We'll do our best to keep moving, but again, those things happen. So in terms of how we're gonna try to create or foster some interaction with you all, again, there will be 3 Q&A sessions. We also have some live polls that we've built in, so we'll be able to pause the presentation and ask you some polls. Unfortunately, if you're joining by phone, that will not be really an option, but if you are on the webinar, you will be able to provide your response via the poll. And that's not only a way for us to make sure you're awake, but also actually helps us gather some very helpful feedback as we move forward in this process. You will be able to access, again, this recording, as well as we had, I don't know, close to 100 or plus sign up for this webinar. So there are likely going to be way more questions than we'll be able to answer. We are collecting all of the questions we received during this webinar. We will then be creating an FAQ that will be posted on the website within the coming weeks. So hopefully we do get to address most of those questions, but if we do not address your question, you still have concerns or feedback that we haven't captured or covered, you are definitely encouraged to email the project web or email address at yalecorridor@denvergov.org. Finally, I want to acknowledge that this study is looking at multimodal needs and opportunities along the Yale corridor and surrounding area. Pretty much anytime we talk about multimodal needs and ideas, that involves a difficult conversation about trade-offs. Our city continues to grow and evolve, and it is not only the population that's growing, but so are the demands on our public right-of-way, which is by and large a constrained resource. Not only do we have cars, we have growing numbers of cyclists, pedestrians, transit users that are all using that right-of-way, and we also have non-mobility needs such as stormwater conveyance and vegetation that are all kind of fighting for that space in the public right-of-way. And of course, who knows what's coming next? We had scooters kind of hit us a couple years ago, and who knows what the future holds in terms of demands on our right-of-way. I point that out because a study like this asks us to think about those needs and demands and find a way to prioritize them, which often means we have to talk about trade-offs, because as much as we wish we could fit everything in that right-of-way, we can't. So we all have different ideas and priorities of what belongs in the right-of-way, and that's totally to be expected as we move through this effort. But we do ask that you bring those opinions, those perspectives, and we do so within a culture of respect for one another and for our staff, because we truly hope to foster a culture of productivity and partnership as we move forward with this study. Whoops. So with that, I am going to kick us off with our first poll. So our very first poll says, what is your top connection to East Yale Avenue? So you can click on multiple options here. The options are, again, I live along East Yale Avenue or close to it. I work along East Yale Avenue or close to it. I access shops and services along East Yale Avenue. Myself or someone in my family goes to school near East Yale Avenue. I use transit and parks near East Yale Avenue, or none of these things capture what your connection to the corridor is. Awesome. I see a lot of folks entering. I'm going to give everyone just a few more seconds here, about 5 more seconds. Oh, we've almost got 100%. We got 75% of folks have voted. I'm going to close the poll now, and let's see what we've got. All right, so I'm going to share the results. Hopefully you all can see this. Looks like the majority of folks, 45%, live along East Yale Avenue or close to it. That's awesome. About 20% access shops and services along Yale, and 18% use transit. That's great. All right, back to the presentation. So, all right, why? And if you're having trouble, by the way, you may have to click out of the polling screen to hide that. I'll pop it back up when we have another poll. All right, so let's get to the why are we here part. So as this slide says, this is a study which is intended to inform future transportation and multimodal investment in the Yale corridor. At the city, we typically start with a study like this to identify needs, high-level recommended improvements. This then informs what we start to move forward. Those prioritized recommendations, we then usually carry forward and do a bit further assessment to better understand costs, et cetera, which then sets us up to figure out how we could fund those improvements. So this is a really important first step to helping us identify what investments the city wants to make in Yale corridor. Why do we do this? Well, the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, we are committed to making our city safer and more accessible. We even have goals associated with our mobility action plan as well as Vision Zero to that end. And so studies like this help us identify or better establish what that multimodal vision is for the corridor. And that really helps not only inform city investments, but also helps us bring the private sector along as new developments occur along the corridor. And how do we do that? Well, with this study, there's kind of two big inputs. One is a data-driven technical analysis, and we have a wonderful firm on board, Parsons, who's really helping us with all of that. And then we also are here today talking to you to make sure that while we have that data-driven technical side, we also have the community input side. And those two things will work together to help us with our final product, which will be, again, kind of a recommendation of improvements along the corridor. So this is the last slide where I'm going to be talking at you, and then I'm going to hand it over. But I want to make sure everyone's a little bit more oriented geographically of where we're talking. So this map shows you the extent of our study area. We are studying Yale Corridor from Downing Street to Holly. The extents of this were established based on a couple factors. The length covers a variety of land uses that occur along Yale, so we can have a more comprehensive look at how the corridor operates in these different conditions. Downing was selected as the western boundary. Originally, we were thinking Franklin because there is a proposed bike lane that we want to make sure we're connected to with this multimodal effort, but we extended it to Downing because we also recognize that there's a really vibrant little commercial area just north of Yale on Downing, and we want to make sure that our multimodal network that we build out really helps people connect from destination to destination. On the east side, we actually originally were considering stopping at I-25, but then we recognized I-25 is a barrier and we want to figure out how to get past those barriers. So we wanted to extend it farther east. So we stopped over at Yale and Holly. And a couple reasons for that are we've actually studied Yale east of I-25 all the way to Syracuse in the past. And so we have a lot of information already east of here, but also we have a couple of bond funded projects that are gonna help us with some improvements starting at Yale and Holly and moving east. So we wanna make sure that we can kind of connect those dots along the Yale corridor. And now with that, I am actually going to hand it over to my colleague, Geneva.
Thank you, Ashley. So thank you, first of all, for coming tonight and for spending a really beautiful evening inside. We appreciate it. And so I'm Geneva Houghton. I'm the city project manager for this project. And I first just want to talk about how where we are and where we're going is building upon a lot of the great work that's been done in the city thus far. So the Comprehensive Plan 2040 was developed with the input of thousands of Denverites. And there are some key values that came from that and some goals that we want to achieve. And I'm not going to touch on all of these, except to say that really what comes from this is that we want to build a Denver that's made up of strong and authentic neighborhoods. We want to build a Denver that's connected and safe and accessible, and we want it to be a healthy and active place to be. And so we're going to work together to build upon all of those things to come up with a suite of recommendations to help us get there. Next slide, Ashley. So with that, we are also looking at the work that was done for Blueprint Denver. This came out in 2019, and it really digs into it to say we're going to focus on complete neighborhoods and building complete networks. And this inverted triangle that you see to the right is actually saying, let's change the priority for how people get around. So let's prioritize how people walk and use mobility devices at the top and make sure that a city is comfortable for them. And then let's look at how people bike and take transit and freight and then drive. And we also want to make sure that everything that we're doing builds upon some of the citywide plans, like the multimodal action plan that the mayor had, and the Denver Vision Zero action plan, which I'll get into later. So we're using all of these building blocks to say, okay, great, let's dig in a little bit deeper and come up with some recommendations. And I also want to touch upon the University Park Neighborhood Plan from 2008. Many of you may have been part of this. And this also feeds into those same sort of themes that we're seeing of creating a sense of place, of connecting gathering places for people through multimodal design, improving safety always, and upgrading infrastructure where we can. Next slide, Ashley. So right now it's almost May, which is hard to believe, and we have done a great deal of data collection. So we want to make sure that we're always operating with good data. So we've done that analysis, and now we're coming to the public, to you tonight, to say, how did we do? Did we get this right? And then we're going to move in and develop some goals for the plan to say, at the end of this, at the end of the year, where do we want to be and how can we get there? We're going to work on some recommendations. We'll come back to you and say, again, did we get these right? Did all of these concerns that you've brought to us and things that you want to see for your community, have we captured them correctly? And then we'll finalize those and wrap them up by the end of the year. And throughout all of this, we don't know exactly what public outreach will look like because of COVID. We can just promise you that we will try to do our best to get to you how we can in a lot of different ways and do our best to really be as engaging as possible. So we hope to see you in person, but if not, we will see you through a screen. Next slide, thanks.
Great. With that, we have another poll. So I'm going to pull that up really quick. All right, polling number 2. So if you are traveling along East Yale Avenue corridor, how do you usually get around? I think you can only choose one option for this. Do you walk, bike, use a scooter, take transit, drive, carpool, Uber, Lyft, or some other way? Give folks a little bit to answer this. Last time we had pretty good participation. All right, looks like we've slowed down. So I'm gonna end the polling and share the results. All right, so not surprising, about 76% drive on the corridor. The next number is about 20% bike along the corridor. And then next after that, we have 4% walk. Awesome, so definitely a lot of folks driving, so that's helpful for us to know. I'm gonna stop sharing those results. And I'm gonna X out of that screen. We are going to then jump into, we have time for just a couple of questions. We wanna keep moving, but I am going to move us along. So just keep this corridor map up while we ask a couple questions. So, all right, it looks like we have over, by the way, 67 folks in the room, which is an awesome turnout. So obviously we're gonna have lots of questions. I'm gonna start with one we actually received prior to this meeting, which is, have you considered more crosswalks or lights to make it more comparable to Dartmouth or Iliff? That's a question we received from David. Geneva, do you wanna take that?
Sure, thanks David for the question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. And right now we're just trying to make sure that we understand this area well enough, and then we're gonna move into answering some of those questions and trying to figure out how to solve the problems. And in terms of crossings, and we'll get into this later, we know that crossing Yale is not easy. And so absolutely, one of the recommendations that I can see us working towards is figuring out some of those locations where we may want to have a new signal or a protected crossing. And I will also say that there are, of course, a number of engineering decisions that have to be made to say if that crossing makes sense. We have to prioritize it against all the other signals in the city. So it's not necessarily an easy process. But I do think that at the end of this, we'll have some spots where we are moving forward with some recommendations about crossing locations. Thank you for your question.
And again, as a reminder, feel free to type in your questions using the chat function on the Zoom app. We have time for one more question, then we want to keep this rolling because then we're really going to get into the kind of meat of what we've been discovering so far. But Ryan, maybe you could take this one. What can be done to better ensure cars aren't speeding on Yale?
We will get into more of the speed and really safety discussions here in a couple slides, but from a discussion about what can be done about speeds, you can do simple fixes like lowering speed limits if it's justified. We could work on increased patrols, things like that, but there are also engineering and design mechanisms that could be employed to try to reduce speeds. We're talking about road diets or, speed islands, things like that. So I think there's a lot of different things, and that's really the point of this study, is to really evaluate kind of where those issues are, how rampant the issue actually is, and the threat that it poses, and then what we can really do in a really efficient and functional manner to try to bring those down.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, and I see there's a number of other questions coming in, and I actually think a lot of them kind of set us up well for this next section of the presentation. So hopefully we can address them through this, but if not, we will pause for another Q&A in just a minute. So with that, Geneva, do you want to keep rolling?
Absolutely, thanks. So we're going to dive into some of those existing conditions that we've seen in the corridor. And first we start out with land use. So how are people using this area and what's it zoned for? And the majority of our project extent is single family residential, which you all probably know because most of you are living right around there. And then with that, we also have some pockets of commercial activity, mostly around Colorado Boulevard, north and south of Yale. We have some community centers like the library, the YMCA. We have parks, we have trails. And then around the light rail station, there's a little bit of commercial activity as well. But for the most part, this is very low density residential. Next slide. Thanks. So how is it when you're biking? Along Yale, there is a 0.8 mile buffered bike lane that goes right around the bend. And with that buffered bike lane, we know that it doesn't necessarily connect to any other existing infrastructure. And that's definitely a problem. It's a challenge for people who want to bike from their house to a connection like a trail. And we know that it's definitely something for us to be involved in and to be looking at more. And also we've heard from our stakeholders and some others that it's particularly crossing Colorado is a challenge, and then accessing the light rail station by bike is also a challenge. Next slide, please. So this map just shows you the pink line is the extent of the corridor. The blue line there shows that buffered bike lane. And then we can see how there isn't a direct connection to either the Harvard Gulch Trail or the Highline Canal. And then down below on Dartmouth, I do want to point out that there is a future bike lane coming in, and we have other citywide bike lanes that will be coming in future years that will help bridge some of these connections, but none of them are specifically on Yale. Next slide, please. So how is it as a pedestrian? We know that most of the sidewalks along this corridor are less than 5 feet wide, and almost all of them are directly adjacent to the roadway. So how that feels when you're walking tends to be pretty uncomfortable. You're getting passed by cars that are going pretty quickly, and you may not have that buffer next to you to enjoy the street in a different way. We also know that there are very infrequent signalized crossings, and then along the south side of Yale, when there's bad weather, that there tends to be an accumulation of snow and ice that makes it harder to walk across and harder for people who are using mobility devices like a wheelchair. Next slide. So what this map is showing you is all of those yellow lines, that's the project corridor. And all of those are sidewalks that are less than 5 feet wide. And I think it's interesting as we're talking about maintaining a 6-foot distance during the era of COVID, that it's challenging to even walk on a sidewalk that's 5 feet wide and not cross someone closer than that. So we recognize that citywide that's a challenge. The red lines there by the park and then roughly between Franklin and Marion are sidewalk gaps. And those are just areas where we don't have a sidewalk, one on the north side of Yale and the other on the south. Otherwise, though, this is one continuous connection for sidewalks, certainly with some challenges of accessing the light rail station. Next slide, please. So what we've heard from our analysis and from our stakeholder committee is that we know that crossing this corridor is particularly challenging. So each of the little yellow symbols is showing where our signalized crossings are located. And what those black arrows are showing you is that, in fact, while there are signalized crossings, there's a really pretty far distance between those. So between Downing and University, it's 3/4 of a mile. Between Fillmore and Colorado, it's 0.7 miles. And then it's another 1/2 mile between Colorado and Dahlia. So what that means as a pedestrian is that it can be pretty hard to want to go to cross the street, whether there are too many cars, You may want to cross at a signalized crossing, but it's not really convenient to walk 3/4 of a mile or 1/4 of a mile out of direction to do that. So instead, people end up walking and maybe making an unsafe choice by doing that. And so in making sure that we have better north-south crossings and certainly just better connections north-south is something that we're going to be looking into. And I also want to note that there is a future signal that will be, construction will start on that this summer at Yale Avenue and Yale Circle, right by the light rail station. And that's going to be a key connection for people who are accessing the station, and certainly providing more safety and consistency for everyone who's using that area. Next slide. And I'm going to hand it off to Ryan.
And yeah, thank you, Geneva. I'll give everyone a heads up. You may hear dogs barking in the background, so we're at home. Again, thank you. But you know, since most of you live along this corridor, you know that a lot of the bus transit does not travel along Yale, with the exception of the 27 and the 46 towards the east end of our corridor. But you know, once you get west of Colorado Boulevard, there's no transit service on Yale itself. All of those are perpendicular routes, whether it's the 12 or the 24 or the 40 on Colorado Boulevard. So, you know, what we looked into was, you know, really where are those nodes? Where are folks really utilizing transit in, you know, heavier numbers than other locations? And that's what those yellow circles are showing. So, you know, no surprise, Yale Station, given the light rail service there, is the highest utilized stop along our corridor here, with the others being Yale and Claremont, and Colorado and Yale, which again should be really no surprise. But you know, what we're looking at is really how we can best use that corridor, and where really those mechanisms for mobility are coming from along this project area. Next slide. So parking is obviously a very hot topic, really in any corridor that you know, these kinds of studies are going on. What we're seeing in this corridor is that there is low parking utilization, and that can sometimes give the, you know, unsafe appearance of wider travel lanes. So this corridor is very lightly parked on average. You can see through the table on the right there that on normal, say, weekdays and Saturdays, you're looking at single-digit utilization numbers, and in many cases low single-digit utilization numbers. The exception is on Sunday mornings for religious services, and that's really focused on the western end of the corridor. And we'll have a graphic describing that here in a minute. But it's important to note too that 12% of households along this corridor actually have front doors that face Yale. The rest of the homes have house faces that face the intersecting cross streets. So, you know, in many cases, the parking for those homes takes place on those side streets, not on Yale itself, which again lends itself to the light utilization. Next slide, Ashley. So on this map here, you can see the red line. That is where there is no on-street parking. The green shows where there is on-street parking and where that utilization is typically less than 10%. Towards that west end there, towards Downing, you'll see that's where we're seeing that utilization predominantly on Sunday mornings, again, with church services there. So, you know, for those, since most of you live along that corridor, this really comes as no surprise in terms of where the parking is, but it may be a surprise as to, you know, from our measurements, how lightly parked this corridor is. Next slide. So, you know, when we think about how folks are driving along this corridor, the majority of you do travel along this corridor in your vehicle. It comes as, you know, no surprise that the further east we go, the closer to I-25 that we get, the higher the traffic counts become. When we're over towards Downing, you can see, you know, those are less than 10,000 vehicles a day. As you travel east across Colorado, you know, we're about 16,000 cars a day. Then it quickly increases as we travel east towards the highway and towards the Highline Canal and towards Holly. Those black arrows that you see, those are the predominant turning movements at each of those intersections as well. So again, that's In some cases that can play an inherent safety issue as well. One I'll point out is that right turn from northbound University onto eastbound Yale, there is about 200 cars an hour that are turning right during the peak periods, and that from a bike and ped standpoint, that can pose a real safety risk. Next slide. So speeds, we know that this is a concern along this corridor. So it's important to note the 85th percentile speed that we've identified through these 3 different segments. that is how the city identifies where the speed limit really should be. That's taken, through measurements, and we can track how fast people are traveling along there. So you can see, in the 30-mile-an-hour zone to the west of University, the 85th percentile is slightly below that speed limit. Between University and Colorado, that is the segment where the average speed, or the 85th percentile speed, is actually above the speed limit of 25 and significantly above. Then again, as we travel further east, that 85th percentile drops a bit below. Those maximum speeds in there, those are obviously very dangerous speeds along this corridor, but those are what we have measured during our various analyses periods. Next slide. Back to you, Geneva.
All right, thanks. So one of the reasons why we look so carefully at speeds is because speed is so connected to safety. And earlier we talked about the Vision Zero action plan, and this is the city's commitment to eliminate all traffic fatalities and serious injuries by 2030. And the way that we're going to do that is through a number of things. It's through better street design, it's through creating a culture of safety, it's by government agencies working together, and it's by all of us working together to make this happen. And this graph that you see shows how we're doing so far. And in 2019, we had 70 people die on Denver streets just by getting around, by walking and biking and driving. And that's 70 people too many. So when we're talking about speeds and why we're really looking at that and saying, okay, what's the prevailing speed on any street, and what are some of those maximum speeds? It's important to us because speed is both the #1 factor that will predict a crash happening, and it will also predict the severity of the crash. So the slower that people are going, generally, the safer. Next slide, please. Many of you have probably heard of the city's high injury network. And this was an analysis done as part of the Vision Zero action plan. And what this tells us is that it's only 5% of the streets in Denver that actually comprise 50% of all traffic deaths. And these are streets that probably don't surprise you. It's the Colfaxes, it's the universities, it's the Colorados of Denver. It's those streets that tend to have higher volumes and higher speeds, and also, therefore, in many ways, have more deaths. So Yale isn't on the high injury network, but it does cross 2 streets of that, Colorado and University. So as we're moving forward with understanding this particular corridor and developing recommendations, we're going to be paying most careful attention to University in Colorado, because we know that that's the place where a lot of crashes are happening and potentially where a lot of those deaths might happen as well. Next slide. So this is a crash heat map, and it shows the darker red of where we see more crashes, and the lighter yellow where we're seeing fewer, and the blue even fewer than that. And I don't think that this will surprise very many of you. We do see a preponderance of crashes at Downing and University, certainly at Colorado, and then at I-25, and that stretch between I-25 and Hawley. And where we're seeing some of the yellow are places where we will want to pay special attention. And I think it's interesting that we're seeing crashes certainly at those signalized intersections, but we're also seeing them in places where it's not an intersection, which from an engineering perspective, you tend to see crashes at an intersection because that's where you have 2 movements that are happening. So it's interesting when we're seeing it not really east of Colorado. And I should also note that
Geneva, I think we might
the
have.
crashes. Of course, we're going to see more crashes east. Yes. Ashley.
You cut out a little bit. I didn't know. You said, I want to point out, and it sounded awesome and important, and then none of us.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll try not to repeat myself. I was just saying, I just want to point out that we have a number of crashes that are happening east of Colorado, and that's likely due to higher traffic volumes. But overall, along the corridor, our focus is going to be on increasing safety and decreasing serious injuries and fatalities. Thanks. I'll pass it back to Ashley.
Great. Thank you, Ryan and Geneva. So we're going to move again into another question and answer period. I want to encourage you all to please enter your questions. You can do so by clicking on that chat box. We actually have staff that are helping us kind of take all of those questions as they're coming in and organize them. But I'm going to start with one question we received from Nathan. I'm going to put this one, maybe start with Ryan. What traffic calming measures are in your toolbox? Only visual narrowing or physical measures proven functional in reducing speed and volumes of vehicles, like speed bumps or speed tables? Maybe start with Ryan and hand off to Geneva on that.
Sure. So when we think about what's in our toolbox at this point in the study, our toolbox is open. We're not limiting ourselves to what the right answer is to try to fix these. Where we're at right now is trying to identify exactly what the problems are. Now, there are engineering issues and engineering decisions that the city has made, that things that they maybe don't want to do. I know that there's some issues with speed tables or speed bumps when we think about snowplows and things like that. That may be a decision that the city makes to try and avoid. But it's going to be a mix of visual changes and design issues, but then also kind of physical and built infrastructure improvements as well to try to work on those issues along this corridor. But again, the toolbox at this point, we're at the 50,000 foot level here before we start really bringing this down. So it's wide open right now.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I think you covered that one pretty well. Oh, sorry, and let me just advance this so we can be actually looking at the corridor while we think about our questions. Another question, maybe Geneva, you could handle this. I would love to bike along Yale, but currently feel it's unsafe to do so. What plans are there already in the works to address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And right now, so in 2011, the city went through a citywide bike plan exercise. And from that, we have the Denver Moves plan. And Denver Moves shows us overall in the city, the corridors that we want to emphasize and make sure that we're building out for biking. And many of you may know that I'm going to mess up that year, but the mayor committed to building 125 miles of bikeways by 2023. And so this particular corridor doesn't have a recommendation from the Denver Moves plan. And so that's why we're here tonight to be talking about this particular corridor and saying, okay, where did we miss back in 2011 and then in the update in 2015, and where should we be focusing again? And I think hearing from people that there's certainly a desire to reach some of the recreational rides and to bike on the High Line, that's great, but it may not provide that same sort of commuting and direct trip that people are seeking. So those are the kind of conversations and feedback that we're trying to get from you tonight. And those will help us in developing recommendations for you to react to later this summer. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you, Geneva. All right, I think we're getting a number of questions kind of about Yale and Holly specifically, and I'll actually take over on this question, but we received a question from Michael. The Yale-Holly intersection involves Arapahoe and Denver. Can you comment on how that partnership will come together to address that intersection? Great question. Obviously, you're very in tune with those bizarre municipal boundaries in that area. So Yale and Holly and kind of that stretch. So we actually have been partnering with Arapahoe County since as early as 2014 around that area specifically. And so we have a number of studies that we partnered with Arapahoe County to look at Yale in that area. We were partners on those studies, and then partners also on some follow-up design work, as well as to really kind of help us better understand what our options are there. We also partnered with them on Highline Canal Crossing study that they did. Arapahoe County led, but we were partners in that effort as well. So as far as moving forward, we absolutely will continue to partner with them. I help manage our relationship with Arapahoe County. We're working with them actually in District 6 on another project. So we have a really great relationship with their transportation department, and they are also partners on this study as well. So we actually have somebody from the city or from Arapahoe County who is one of our stakeholders and helps us out as we move this effort forward. So I don't know if you heard me say partner enough times, but we are very strong partners with Arapahoe County, and we are working very hand in hand with them in terms of how we implement any improvements around the Yale and Holly area, because as you noted, it's kind of some funky municipal boundaries there. Okay, so with that, I'm going to keep us moving along. We will move on to our next section, which, yeah, take it away.
All right. So we're going to talk about some focus areas along the corridor, and I want to reinforce that by no means are we saying that these are our only 5 focus areas. These are just areas that have come up through the existing conditions analyses as issues surrounding safety or access or general mobility, things like that. So we'll get into all 5 of these as we go forward. So next slide, Ashley. So as Geneva and Ashley have talked about, and I'll reinforce, and I'm sure it's not news to any of you, that crossing Yale north-south is not easy. Again, this is the same image we had identified earlier. This is an issue that's well documented, given that it's 3/4 of a mile between a couple crossings on the western half of this corridor, and we're looking at a half mile in a very busy corridor as we travel east here. So, from an efficiency standpoint from traffic, we want to be cognizant of the fact that there's lots of people that drive on this corridor. Most of you drive on this corridor. We don't want to be imposing changes to, prioritize one mode over another, but we do want that roadway to have its highest and best use. So there's a delicate balance to be had between all the modes on this corridor. But you can see as we look at this, how infrequent crossings, signalized crossings can be if that is, where folks really choose to cross that roadway. Next slide. Now, McWilliams Park, we know this is a great community asset and it is highly utilized. And there are several access and safety issues surrounding this area, which, compared to some of the segments of this corridor, has a higher multimodal utilization rate. We've got the signalized crossing at Fillmore, which is great for folks to cross Yale. But we do have the long distances between the park and University, or the park and Colorado. You can see at the bottom there, it's 1/3 of a mile basically over to University, 2/3 of a mile over to Colorado Boulevard. There's a lack of north-south bike routes. We've got Route D13 that travels up Adams and gets its way over to St. Paul there, but and the Harvard Gulch Trail travels through here, but there is that inherent lack. We've got site issues and speed concerns that lead to safety considerations as we travel east as well. There, we go through the curve along Yale, and there's that slight incline as you approach Colorado Boulevard as well that really poses some issues. So for those that have ridden in the bike lane there, I'm sure it's not news either for pedestrians as well. Next slide. Now, Yale and Colorado Boulevard, this is a bear of an intersection, to say the least. And again, not news to anybody. There are about 36,000 vehicles per day on Colorado Boulevard, or at least this segment of Colorado Boulevard. And you can see on Yale, it's a fairly consistent traffic count there, between 17 and 18,000 vehicles along Yale going through there as well. So from a bike and ped standpoint, it is imposing. And from a vehicular standpoint as well, this can be a mess to travel through, especially during peak periods. Colorado Boulevard is 7 lanes wide. through this area. We've got 3 through lanes in each direction, as well as a turn lane to try to cross that. This is again a very busy retail and commercial intersection, or I should say intersections, given that there's 2. We've got civic uses as well, and community like the YMCA and Station 24 for the Denver Fire Department. So in essence, and to reinforce what Geneva had mentioned earlier, in addition to I-25 being a barrier, Colorado Boulevard is a huge barrier along this corridor as well, and really plays into a lack of safety and a lack of comfort and a lack of efficiency across all modes traveling along Yale. Next slide. And reinforcing what I had mentioned about this being a busy retail and commercial intersection, you can see, and this by no means is an exhaustive list. So if there is a use on here that we didn't catch, we were not looking to exclude anybody, but these are just some of the major uses along these corridors that are really high traffic generators through here as well. So, and the pictures on either side there, those show the pedestrian and bike environment, which is unfriendly to say the least. Next slide. Now Yale Station serves about 2,000 transit passengers on a normal day. Obviously not right now, but on normal days between bus and rail. Now, as we've discussed, pedestrians accessing the Yale Station, usually from the south side in University Hills there, that is has been compared to playing Frogger, trying to get across there, both to and from the station. Now, with the signal coming in at UCL Circle, that will greatly help that, but it's still, can be a messy crossing there. We've got, that signalized crossing again coming later this year. There's the potential for higher speeds. And again, going back to the speed slide that we had discussed earlier, by and large, most cars are abiding by the speed limits. But as folks approach the highway, there is that tendency to kind of accelerate as you get closer to those on-ramps. The other thing we need to consider is the sun glare in the morning and in the evening. That poses safety risks for those accessing the station. Those 129 parking spaces at Yale Station also fill up very early, leading to lots of folks parking into the neighborhoods, which then again feeds into our first bullet where they try crossing the roadway there. Next slide. So then when we look at the area from the Yale Station east to the Highline Canal and the end of our project area, we've got many issues through here, least of which it's a highway interchange intersection, which is just an unfriendly and intimidating intersection to cross. But again, sun glare is prevalent here. Those quick rights coming off and onto the interstate there, those can pose issues and conflicts between bikes, peds, and vehicles. This segment of the roadway is our busiest segment of Yale throughout the entire project area. Again, we're 25,000 plus vehicles each day, and we've got the roadway at its widest is more than 90 feet wide. So if you're on a bike or you're walking, that is a big roadway to try to cross. And when you combine that with the number of vehicles that fly through here every day, it's, it can be, it can be daunting to get through there. And, and as Ashley had discussed, we've got the Highline Canal connection on the far east end there as well. So we've got lots of folks really trying to get over this way so they can access the, the great amenity that the Highline Canal is, but certainly isn't easy to get over there from this part of that corridor. Next slide. All right, so then, where do we go from here? As we had mentioned, we've got the rest of the year to put our findings and our recommendations together. But right now, we're just wrapping up the existing conditions work, and that's really what we were here to share with you all today. So basically, that second yellow dot, that's about where we're at. From here, we'll really finalize our findings. We'll look at the great comments that everybody's put in and make sure that a lot of those concerns and considerations that you're sharing can be reflected in our document and in our understanding of the corridor. But we'll move forward and look at developing a set of common goals and a vision for the corridor, and conducting a technical analysis that encompasses all the different aspects of this corridor. As you can see from the data we've collected, this is a very different corridor depending on where you're at along this. But we need to come up with a comprehensive vision that we can all agree to as we look at the types of improvements. And going back to the toolkit question, from a multimodal standpoint, from really any of these recommendations, we're looking at the whole gambit right now. As we move forward, we'll look at the alternatives analysis development, concept development, some cost estimates. We'll have some renderings for folks to see from some of the recommendations that we put together. We'll put those together later this fall. We'll share those findings as we get closer to the end of the year. So all of this will be wrapped up by the time we wrap up 2020. And we'll have another, sorry, actually I'm moving too quick here, but we'll have another public open house later this year once we're ready to share what those draft recommendations look like. And we'll have several pop-up events of varying formats. Obviously in this environment, we're looking at exactly how we can best engage folks, whether we need to stay virtual like this, or if maybe later this year things can change and we're able to meet you all face to face and talk about this corridor as well. So we'll be publicizing that through many different mediums. So we'll make sure to get that information out well in advance so you can all hopefully plan to attend those, again, whichever format they take.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ryan. Okay, so we're gonna do one more poll. There we are. All right, so if you give me just a second while I pull that poll up, launch it. It says, what are your top concerns along East Yale Avenue? You can choose as many as you want that apply. So the first is slowing cars on East Yale, crossing major intersections, sidewalks, accessing the light rail station, crossing East Yale on foot, biking east-west through the corridor, accessing the Highline Canal, or other. Give everyone a few moments to look through these options and plug in what matters most to them. And again, this really helps us as we are moving forward with this existing condition, starting to move forward into thinking through how does this existing condition information, both the data as well as the information we're collecting from you all, help influence the study as we continue to move that forward. Give everyone just a few more seconds. We've got about 70% participation. We usually get about 80, but all right, slowing down. All right, so I'm gonna end the poll and I'm gonna share the results with you now. So it looks like in terms of top concerns, the number one concern is sidewalks at 60%. Under sidewalks, we have as the next one at 48% accessing the Highline Canal, closely followed by 46% of crossing major intersections. So that's great to hear. It sounds like that's in line with what we've been hearing and thinking. Other concerns that are definitely rising to the top are crossing on foot. And you can read the rest. No, we'll post all of this, but yeah, it looks like pretty much everything's a concern to everyone, which is good. And I'm curious what the others are. So again, feel free to, after this meeting, you can send us an email if we haven't touched on your point or your feedback we haven't quite collected. But again, we will also collect all of the comments we are receiving. So I'm going to stop sharing the results. Next out of that. And as far as the presentation, we are done talking at you. We have about 7 more minutes left and we want to get to some of your questions. So again, here is a map of the corridor and we are going to jump into some questions. So the first one comes from Paul. Maybe Geneva, you can tackle this one. Your poll shows most people drive along Yale. Will the city consider not doing too much to inconvenience drivers who are otherwise obeying the speed limits and other traffic laws?
Sure, thanks, Paul. So it's a good question. And I think that last poll is showing us that while maybe people are using a car for most of their trips, but there's also an interest in improving other ways that we can get around, whether that's walking or biking or accessing transit. And we also know that there are a lot of people in Denver and there will only be more people in Denver. And so we have to figure out a way to create a city where lots more people can live and people can still get around in safe and comfortable ways. So with that, we have citywide goals of increasing the ways that people get to work, which is our most frequent way of measuring transit and transportation trips. So our goal is to actually get to 50% of people in Denver getting to work either by biking, walking, or taking transit. So in order to reach that goal, we're going to have to make some choices and do it a little bit differently than it's been done. So that does mean making choices to make it easier for people who want to walk and bike and take transit for some of their trips of the day, understanding that people will still probably have a car and will still be using a car for some of their other trips. So thanks for your question.
Great. Next question. I might actually tackle this one real quick, but it says, this one comes from Amy. Thank you for your question. Would you consider making signals automatic and eliminating beg buttons on Yale? As a bicyclist, some intersections never turn green for me because I'm not heavy enough to trigger the light. So I think that there are kind of two ways that we can address this. One, through this study, we definitely want to highlight and make sure we note where there are issues crossing. So we can definitely make sure those are captured through this study. Second of all, if there are very specific intersections that you are having a hard time crossing, some of those signal upgrades can be, if we have the technology and the infrastructure is able to support it, we can make those using our area engineer way to address some of those issues. So if you use our 311 system and have a specific question about an intersection, you can enter it in 311 or pocketgov.org and let us know, and that gets routed to an engineer who is specifically assigned to this district to look at that. I know we're getting a lot of questions, so I do want to take one other question really quick, and then I'm going to hand them back to you, Geneva and Ryan, but I know that we're getting a ton of questions about Holly and the Highline Canal. So just to clarify what is happening there. So as part of the bond, the Elevate Bond package that was passed, and I believe it was 2017, there was a project identified in that package for improved connections at Holly and Yale to the Highline Canal. And that project is based on the recommendations from a study that I mentioned earlier that looked at a number of ways to access and cross the Highline Canal at that intersection. And so we are using the findings from that study to inform that project. Our ideal project will include an underpass. However, and that's what is captured in the bond language, is that we would have an underpass at that intersection. However, like many projects, we have to take those visions, those project ideas, and then work through the feasibility of them. And so that project has not kicked off in terms of design. So we're not exactly sure what the design will ultimately look like at that intersection. We will do our best to meet the intent of the bond. And then, like I said, we also have to look at all the other factors, the feasibility, et cetera. And so a good idea of what it could look like is if you are able, and we will include this in the FAQ, we'll include a link to the study that was conducted that looked at the Highline Canal crossings, but we will be using those as guidance for how to move forward with that project. So again, that funding, the design for that project has not been allocated via the bond program yet, so the design has not kicked off. But when that project kicks off, we will make sure that folks who are interested are notified, and there will be a public engagement process with that project once that starts moving. And so again, that's not captured in this process, this study, but we know it's coming. So we want to make sure that we consider the connections all the way to that Highline Canal improvement. I'm going to kick over to, let's see, we've got maybe Geneva, can you help us with this question? Can you please clarify who determines use of the right-of-way and who owns the right-of-way?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when we say the right-of-way, it's technically owned by the city and county of Denver. And yet we often say that it's the public's right-of-way. So when we're making decisions about how to allocate space, and also I should clarify that there's the right-of-way that very often we're actually focused about the right-of-way that happens right when an individual property owner's property ends, and then it's the sidewalk and then the street. And so when we're making decisions about that, it definitely depends on a number of different factors. We're looking at safety, we're looking at how people are moving, we're getting engagement from the public. We also have to make sure that these things work from an engineering perspective so that our roadways can continue to drain, and we can have functioning streets in the city. But the public's right of way is owned by the city and county of Denver and therefore a part of the public. Thanks, Ashley.
Great, thanks, Geneva. All right, Geneva, maybe you can tackle this one as well.
Okay.
As the study goes west of University, I hope you are considering improving the Harvard Gulch Trail between University and Downing, as was done 2 years ago between Colorado and University. This question comes, or this comment comes from Councilman Cashman. So I know this is something that we have talked about and kind of why we call this the Yale corridor and are trying to talk about the boundaries, but maybe you can speak to what we mean by the multimodal improvements to the corridor and how that may apply to Harvard Gulch.
Yeah, thank you, Councilman Cashman. So you see the kind of dotted line that we provided, which goes a little north and a little south of Yale. We're keeping that dotted because we don't have a hard line for our boundaries. We're looking at how does this area function as a corridor? And so the question of whether or not we're considering any improvements to the Harvard Gulch Trail, that's absolutely on the table. We are coordinating with our Denver Parks Department and making sure that whatever recommendations also match with what they are moving forward. So we will document that, and I wouldn't be surprised for us to have a recommendation, particularly about improving that when we move further into the project. So thanks again.
Wonderful. Well, we are at time. It is 7 o'clock. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. We really appreciate you joining us. We know it is a beautiful evening out. We want to make sure you have time to go enjoy it. So again, we are going to have an FAQ that we are going to pull together based on the questions we received today. We are also going to put more information up on our website. And if you have a burning question that was not addressed tonight, definitely feel free to email yalecorridor@denvergov.org. The team will actually be helping respond to all of those. So it won't be just one of us. You'll get hopefully the best response we can think of to respond to you. So we definitely hope to be in touch with you all as we move through this project. We really appreciate your time today and hope to see you on our next meeting. So thank you all very much for your time and have a great
Thank you, everyone.